30 Days of Persuasion Plays with me, Paul Macetta. Again, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel so you get updates when I release these videos, but more importantly, so that you get updated when I release the Persuasion Playbook, so you can get all of these techniques plus an additional 71. You're going to get 101 ways to gain compliance from people. And the book is ultra simple. You're basically going to get 101 lessons like the ones that I'm covering here, and each lesson is going to include an application and an example. That's it. Simple, straightforward, easy to use. I don't want to see you miss out on getting your copy, so make sure you jump on the YouTube channel, subscribe so that you get notifications and updates. So, today's episode, classic NLP presupposition, and that is this. The meaning of all communication is the response that it elicits. Let me say that again. The meaning of all communication is the response that it elicits. And this comes to us from a guy who I'm a big fan of, Dr. Milton Erickson. So for those of you who don't know, NLP is a body of knowledge that was created by Dr. Richard Bandler and John Grinder over 30 years ago, which enables us to basically understand the way people think and behave. It also enables us to model excellence. So if someone can do something, we can model their body chemistry, their actions, their thought processes, and do the exact same things. I'm not here to sell you on NLP. If you've ever heard of Anthony Robbins and the life-changing breakthroughs that he's able to achieve with celebrities, athletes, other high-caliber people, he's using basic NLP to do that with people. So it's a very powerful body of knowledge. Well, when these guys, Bandler and Grinder, were developing NLP, they wanted to study master communicators, and they studied 3 people. In my opinion, the best one of all was Milton Erickson. So Milton Erickson was a medical doctor who's also known as the father of modern hypnotherapy. At 17 years old, he contracted polio. The guy was basically paralyzed for months on end, could not move, could not do anything. So what he did was he took that time and used it as an opportunity to observe people. Just sat in bed all day long and observed the nurses, his parents, all the people that were around him, and he started to really pay close attention to their verbal language and their nonverbal language, and basically he gave himself a mastery level education in how people communicate with each other. And then he went on to cure himself of polio using hypnosis by memorizing how his muscles used to move, and was able to get himself to walk again and function as a fully functioning human being. So he's an amazing guy. So they studied this guy because of this master level education that he gave himself in communication. When he became a hypnotherapist, he was able to achieve results with his clients that other people simply could not, because he used a very indirect approach. He created an enormous amount of rapport with people and a connection with people. And one of the things that Erickson really, truly believed in and stood by was the fact that the meaning of all communication is the response that it elicits. So what that means is, if you want to become a master communicator, if you want to become an expert at persuasion, you have to abandon this mentality that you're not responsible for what happens at the end of a communication cycle with somebody. So the communication cycle, I've talked about this before, is basically an interaction between you and somebody else. So when you're communicating with somebody, that person has thoughts, desires, beliefs, behaviors in their mind. And you have thoughts, desires, beliefs, behaviors in your mind as well. When you communicate with somebody, those things cause you to say certain things. Then that person internalizes what you said based on their thoughts and beliefs, and then they send out a message back to you, and then this communication cycle continues until the line of communication is closed. So it's a constant and never-ending cycle of communication until it actually stops, right? And so as a master communicator, you have to be able to take ownership and responsibility for how that person is internalizing whatever you're saying. So you have to abandon this mentality of, well, they misunderstood what I said, or I was trying to say this, but it came out the wrong way, or they took it too personally, or they just weren't getting it. That has to go out the window. That's a victim mentality. That's an I'm not responsible for anything mentality. That's a it's their fault mentality. And master communicators like Erickson didn't have that mentality, and so you shouldn't either. And so what you have to realize is that the meaning of all communication is the response that it elicits. So if you sit down with somebody, or you're having a communication or a conversation with somebody, and you want that person to work harder after the communication. So maybe it's an employee that works for you and you see that they're slacking on the job a little bit. Maybe they're calling out a little too much, or they're leaving early or coming in late. You want to have a conversation with them. And at the end of that conversation, you want that person to ultimately feel like they should be working harder, but in a positive way. But instead, at the end of the conversation, the person resents you, starts looking for another job, and actually becomes less committed than they were before you actually had that conversation with them. Then you did something wrong during the communication cycle. So the response that was elicited was that the person is actually doing less when you wanted them to do more. So the meaning of that communication, you went into it thinking that the meaning of the communication would be that they're going to work harder, and they came out of it working less. Well, then the meaning of that communication was that that person works less now, regardless of what your intention was. So the very first step is you have to take ownership of the entire situation. I know that may seem like a lot to handle, a lot to take on. You might say, well, I can't control the outcome of every situation, the way every person thinks. It's not about that. It's not about having complete control over everything that happens. It's just about taking ownership and abandoning the victim mentality, because that shift alone, that slight little switch in the way you view the interaction, will cause you to be able to tap into the resources that you need to make the conversation or the interaction a favorable one for you. But as long as you abandon that and continue to blame other people and not take responsibility, you're not going to be able to tap into those resources. So step number one is to take ownership. Step number two is to ask yourself, have a conversation with yourself and ask, what can I do better? So take a look at some of the not so favorable lines of communication or interactions that you've had with people where your intention was for one thing to happen and something very far away or very far off from that actually happened, and ask yourself, what could I have done better and what can I do better moving forward? And then the last thing is that you got to speak to people's worldview. So when you communicate with them, you have to communicate in a way with them that supports their worldview or their beliefs. If you are trying to get a point across to somebody, but in the process of making your point, you keep talking about things that maybe are irrelevant to the conversation, but they contradict their worldview, then you're going to have a problem. So, for example, I have a lot of friends in law enforcement. I fully support law enforcement. And so if I was having a conversation with one of them, for example, and I was talking about better ways that people and law enforcement could communicate more effectively, and I was saying that, if when people got pulled over by cops, if they would just be a little bit more respectful, things would go a lot easier. And then in the process of that, I said something like, but the problem is that cops can be very abusive and cops can be mean and cops can, overuse their authority. If I'm having a conversation with a police officer whose worldview is completely different than that, then in the process of getting my point across, what I'm doing is I'm constantly taking jabs at their worldview. And now what happens is, instead of them focusing on my message, they're deviating and now focusing on why they don't believe what I'm saying, because I'm counteracting their worldview. So that's just an example that I'm giving you. But the bottom line is that you have to make sure that you are in line with their worldviews when you present to them. Because if you're not, again, what it's going to do is distract them from your core message and have them focusing on why everything that you're saying is wrong because it doesn't coincide with their world belief. So, number one, take ownership. Number two, ask, what can I do better? And number three, speak to their worldview.